Lei, can you hear me, Cheng Lei?
Yes, I can.
We have a stunned, silent audience here in Bangkok,
Okay.
looking at what you've just been through. When you see this film, this account of what transpired, how do you feel?
I love the fact that whether it's the documentary or the book or talks like this, I get to tell the truth. I get to be myself. And that is a huge part of being human and being free. So, and I no longer have this philosophy of looking for happiness or for things that feel good in life, because I think going through a lot of pain, the only way to live through it and achieve sort of serenity is to forget avoidance of pain, but to feel everything that washes over us in life as something that's inevitable. And, you know, going, of course, shooting some of the scenes in there, people might say it's triggering, but to me, it's also empowering to be able to give shape to my experience and to let people know about RSDL. It's just such a awful form of torture, and China should abolish it.
One of the things that came across very clearly was that the treatment that you received was torturous for sure, psychologically so. Were you physically hurt at any point in this? Did they ever assault you?
No. And on this, I have to be clear that the Chinese citizens had it much worse. RSDL is tailored to who you are, what your case is about, and to what degree you cooperate. So there is that case of a famous white glove who was beaten to death after 12 hours of RSDL. I know of some people who had it better than me. A medical researcher who was allowed to sit on a sofa and read newspapers and only did 4 months of RSDL. I know of others who suspected that they were being poisoned. So it's tailor-made torture. And for foreign citizens who have that voice or channel to the outside, being the monthly consular visits, they would not physically assault you. But for the Chinese citizens, I believe it's anything goes.
One of the things that's striking in the film is the extraordinary resources that they put into watching you. I mean, the fact that they've got that many people sitting watching you asleep. That extraordinary picture of the woman with the mask looking down at you as you sleep. Were these people all automatons? Did you have any kind of relationship with any of the people who were overseeing you?
Of course I did. They were young. They were from out of town. They were technical school students who were probably counting themselves lucky that they got a job in the famous Ministry of State Security, but not knowing exactly what it entailed. And we're all capable of empathy and kindness, and I just tried to be empathetic to them, knowing that their 4-hour shifts were to a certain extent much tougher than mine, because they were taking turns with the sitting and the standing. They had to wear masks. They couldn't drink water or even go to the toilet. So I always saw that it was as inhumane for them as it was for me. And I just think no normal human being likes to see somebody else in pain, or very few anyway. So, and the more I showed my empathy, the more they were likely to be sympathetic and try to be helpful in as much as they could to me. But they're not officers, they're just lowly paid guards. And I was making a dark joke the other day that I don't think you can afford this sort of torture in Australia, given the, the workers' compensation and the penalty rates you'd have to pay.
You talked about AWADA, this organisation that you belong to, and that you've got 11 prisoners that you're tracking. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
The trouble with arbitrary detention is that we can, because of our experiences and our communications with the families, we see them as arbitrarily detained, but Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade may not see them as arbitrarily detained. The high-profile one would be the Australian engineer Robert Pether, who's been imprisoned in Iraq for over 4 years. And while he was recently granted medical bail, it doesn't mean that he's coming back yet. And I feel to date, AWADA has been able to raise awareness and to show, I mean, we're all living symbols, we're the cost of arbitrary detention. But in terms of legislative change, or appointing a special envoy for these hostage situations, we're not there yet, but it's because it's not such a, let's say, a voter-sensitive topic. It's hard for politicians to act decisively and quickly.
Is it your perception that this kind of hostage taking, if you like, using innocent individuals, journalists and others, is on the rise? I mean, are you paying attention to the rest of the world and trying to look at it in a big panorama?
Of course, authoritarian powers don't think twice about using individuals to achieve their objectives, whereas the Western democracies can't do it back. And it is our respect for individuals that hampers us, but it's also that which protects everyone from the state. So I guess what we can try to do is deter these hostage-taking behaviours by making it such a bad look, so costly for them, especially countries like China that really would like to appear a certain way. And I think my expose of what they actually do may, I guess, discredit their claims of being benevolent and benign.
You're back in a very comforting environment in Australia. reunited with your family and friends. Are you very wary now of stepping out from that safe zone into the broader world? I mean, for example, you're not here.
I was told by a former Chinese spy who has defected in Australia that Cambodia and Thailand are seen as the backyards of China's jurisdiction. So his tasks had been to try to lure, so he claims, dissidents to these two countries so China could arrest them and take them back. I've been to quite a few countries already since release, to Vietnam in the region, to Europe, to South America, North America, and I'm not sure if going to Thailand or Cambodia would be dangerous for someone like me. But I'm hoping you could enlighten me.
Well, I think we would be very cautious about encouraging you on any path that might conceivably go wrong, because that's something that we wouldn't want to be involved with, obviously. Your good friend Sean Tennell told me that he is not allowed, or it's been strongly recommended that he does not come to anywhere in ASEAN by DFAT. So
Yeah.
there seems to be room for caution. I mean, a lot of us would say places like Singapore have to be safe, that nothing would go wrong, but you never know. But Thailand is basically an open, welcoming country, but a lot of interesting things go on here.
Yeah.
When you look back on this awful experience, that it's remarkable that you can be quite positive about aspects of it, but what was, if anything, a positive takeaway from what happened?
The positives are actually quite significant, but then when you look at the cost or the downside, especially losing all those years with my children and seeing the deterioration in my mother's health as a result. But then I was able to read more than 300 books. I became very secure about who I am, what I stand for, and I think I am much better equipped to withstand challenges or face adversity. It's made me a lot more clear-eyed about what life's about and the sort of society I want to be in and want to do more to be a part of. Obviously, the clarity about seeing China's darker side, and with that, the questions, but also some seeds towards an answer about how to deal with a country like China, so strong and yet so insecure. I think I'm going to be able to make meaning out of the suffering, and that's a life-changing moment.
So you were a Chinese-Australian journalist operating in China before this all derailed. What was your perception of the way Chinese journalists were treated? The fact that they are not allowed to be cited as reporters in routine reporting, for example. But what was your perception of the way they were treated?
Well, Chinese journalists in Chinese organizations were, or had it worst, because they couldn't report on the stories that the Chinese news people for foreign organizations could cover. They had to be indoctrinated in many ways. So you've got the Chinese journalists in Chinese organizations, then you've got the Chinese journalists in foreign organizations, and you've got the foreign journalists in foreign organizations. So that's sort of the hierarchy of freedom in reporting. And in recent years, Chinese journalists in Chinese organizations have had it much worse. So not only are the rules tighter on the propaganda directives, but having stories killed, losing entire investigative reporting departments, everyone going into PR companies or working for tech companies as their PR persons. I guess what's resulted is that anyone who has interest in journalism becomes a citizen journalist or feeded to those journalists who are still working outside of China. It's not an ideal state of affairs, but then you continue to see people reporting even in this very, very repressive environment. And what I know of the Chinese journalists working in foreign organizations, sometimes they feel their credit is taken by the actually accredited foreign journalists, and sometimes they feel the narrative is not entirely accurately, not the narrative, that the story isn't accurately told on purpose. It has to fit a certain narrative in order to make it onto the foreign newspaper or website, and in order to win awards. So that's the sort of skepticism I sensed from talking to some of those. And foreign journalists in foreign media organizations just feel they have a lot of pressure to do China stories that head office want, and also the pressure from, they try not to endanger their sources, or one would hope so, and less people to talk to, ever tighter scrutiny from the authorities. And then after what happened to myself and Hayes, I think a lot of self-censorship too. So it's not a
Right,
not a
quickly.
free environment.
Sorry, carry on.
That's okay, I've finished.
We have a microphone here in the audience, so if anybody'd like to ask a question, jump up and identify yourselves. Do it. Whilst everybody's racing to the microphone, I'll ask you another question. When you got back to Australia, you'd been through an incredibly interesting experience. You found out that the government had come up short on that delegation that went to China and didn't even mention you. What were your perceptions of how you viewed the Australian media differently, having had that gap and coming back into it with a very sharpened sense of critical faculties? What was different for you? What did you notice?
I hadn't lived in Australia for about 2 decades, and I was quite shocked by how polarized the reporting on China had become. And I feel there is a great deal of let's say people can be more informed about China, to have more nuance on their reporting. And that's in part driven by the domestic audience who think China either in terms of a big place to go for holiday or a terrible, evil monster. And I think those two characterizations are incorrect. So people often expect me to take the China hating point of view, and they're confused when I still try to talk about balance and nuance and context. And I think people need to separate China from the Chinese people and the Communist Party. So headlines about China sometimes are not about China, they're more about the Communist Party.
Right, we have a question. If you can identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Patty Parker. I live here in Bangkok. Do you know, is there any concern, significant concern amongst the citizens of China about the detention of people without trial for behavior that may not be considered criminal but political? And also, it seems to me as though you were held a long time before you were really put on trial. Is that, are there laws in China that require people to have a trial within a certain length of time? Thank you.
Thank you. There are laws, but when it comes to state security cases, they can all be bent or they go out the window. I think among the populace, there is very little interest, or certainly state security cases are kept so secret that even the families don't know what's going on, and lawyers aren't allowed to tell. So there's very little visibility for the public. It's only until somebody like my cellmates who somehow found themselves in this place that they discovered how little the individual's life meant when it came to so-called state security. And what that was, or what that is murky, the boundaries are vague. They can revert at any time. They've expanded it to these 16 sectors, and a lot of it would shock you as to what constitutes state security or a state secret.
Question.
Hi, thank you for sharing your story. My name is Rick Gazarian. I'm a part-time resident in Bangkok. Kind of a multi-question here. I think you said during your first 6 months, you had to sit on the edge of the bed for approximately 13 hours a day. What did you do for the remainder of the day? Were you allowed to do anything, read a book, write something down? And then what mechanisms did you use mentally to keep your sanity? And then the third part is, at one point you said you were moved into a cell with other prisoners. Were you able to connect with any of them after your freedom?
I'll answer the last one first. I tried to contact their relatives, but they were so scared. Maybe they had already been spoken to by the Ministry of State Security that I think even this, I don't want to endanger them. Let's just say there's been no contact, but it's not through lack of trying. As for RSDL, the 13 hours a day, it depended on which phase it was. When they wanted me to presumably rat on other people, they gave me paper and a pen, and I would write down anything to calm my mind. But in order to keep the pen and paper, I made sure to write something denouncing myself in Chinese every day, so they could look at it and think, oh wow, she's really reflecting on her sins. But then for the rest of the day, I was just writing 7,000 words in tiny English script mixed in with all the vocab that I knew in German and Italian. They gave me some books after the Australian Embassy repeatedly lobbied on my behalf, and they were such lifesavers. I physically shuddered from pleasure just from looking at these words. They were like morphine. And I really think that can save one's sanity. When reading wasn't allowed, I was making everything up in my head. Mental filing, trying to pretend that I was in a movie, then who would play the person to come and rescue me in a helicopter, or I was the DJ in a radio station called Coffin FM, taking love song dedications from other miserable inmates. I would attempt to translate Chinese poems in my head or remember every address I ever lived at. Very, very desperate times because there was no stimuli. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, you smelled nothing. And all you can feel is fear and desperation and anxiety. And you have to keep those at bay. It was a constant struggle. But being with cellmates made it feel so much better. Even though we couldn't talk about our cases, we could still have a joke. I ended up teaching them English songs, teaching them English, and we would try to analyze what we knew of the detention facility, try to work out how many inmates there were, and based on any snippets that we heard from the door when it was open, who was next door, etc. And the book actually does have passages about how we illicitly communicated with the male cells next door via an alphabetical code that we knocked on the walls.
Question?
Yeah, hi, Craig Francis, journalist based in Bangkok. As we sort of seen unfold with the Hong Kong kind of, transition, we've seen that China has said that their laws apply globally. So what sort of risk are journalists at now if you're overseas based? If you were to visit Hong Kong or China and you had written things that were perceived as negative about China, is there a chance that you can just be detained upon arrival based on things you've written in a free country?
I think that depends on what they could get from detaining you. That is the fluctuation in bilateral relations or geopolitical tensions. It's quite costly to detain someone in a political prison or state security prison and they don't like to make work for themselves unless it pays off. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a risk, but you have to think about what they would gain from such an arrest, because being in media, the good thing is where we all have friends who would speak up for us. And I don't know that they want any more bad press. I mean, given how much they've relaxed their visa and other entry requirements to attract foreigners, they'd have to think very carefully about the optics.
Question.
Hello, my name's Gabriel. I'm a consultant. I have two questions. The first thing I wanted to ask was, when you were detained and you were forced to write confessions and say that you were guilty, and you were surrounded by people telling you that you were guilty all the time, did you internalize this at some level? Was there a part of you that thought, you know, yes, I am guilty, I'm bad, I deserve to be here, or something? And my second question is, before you were detained, I mean, you were working in Chinese state media for years. What were your feelings about the Chinese political system back in those days, before you experienced the dark side of it yourself?
Great questions. Yes, I did have Stockholm syndrome. I did feel that I was not so much what they charged me with, but I felt very guilty for having hurt my family, and especially my kids who wouldn't have been able to understand what any of it was about. And I did wish that I had just either not been a journalist or just done the minimum and didn't talk to so many people and didn't try to find out backstories. When I was working for state media for all those years, there were a few phases. When I joined CCTV English in 2002, there was a great deal of hope that China would open up its media sector. My colleagues had all been educated overseas, and they were quite motivated to be, you know, to make it the next CNN, if you like. And as I said, English media is censored much more lightly than Chinese TV, for example. And their sensitivities were Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen, back in those days. But I would always, all these years, every June the 4th, I would wear white, the color of mourning, or black. But for the Chinese channels, they're not even allowed to wear those colors on that day. Then came 2003 to 2012, where I worked as China correspondent for CNBC. They were in a joint venture with the Shanghai Media Group, and I saw how the Chinese partner and the reporters there were censored, and I got told off once because I was also doing Chinese reporting for SMG as part of my role within that joint venture. and I said, today's Buddha's birthday, therefore Korean and Hong Kong markets are closed. And for that, I was told, you mustn't mention religion on Chinese TV. Then after 2012, I worked for CGTN, and it was initially quite promising in terms of I felt I was making a difference, bringing my experience from CNBC to make the business show more dynamic. And my motto was make the show look less bad. I would always try to invite guests who, because the channel tended to use this roster of tried and trusted Chinese experts to comment on everything from the Ebola virus to Chinese stock markets, which is terrible. So I would always be on the lookout for good guests who joined us either from via satellite from overseas or when they were traveling through China to come on to the show. And after Xi came into power, we felt more, personal worshipping stories come on. So I would always try to delete Xi's name from the headlines or the stories because it was just stupid. And because I was the so-called foreign expert, I could polish the scripts, and that's what I did. But in terms of being a part of the state propaganda machine, I did reflect on whether I was the part of the evil that I guess came back on myself. And to a certain extent, that is true. But I had always felt that I was effecting change from within. And I still believe that the stories that I did stand on their own legs. But as a business journalist, did I uncover any trampling of human rights? No. And did I speak up for example, the lawyers who were locked up during the July crackdown? I did give money and help the lawyers' wives, but I didn't do any stories on them. So, yeah, and that is the trial or yeah, that's what I live with.
Julian, who's waiting?
Yes, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. My name is David Cohen of the Associated Press. I wanted to ask, when you leave China in this way, after living there for so long, is it at all possible to keep up relationships with people you knew in China, or does it just get cut off that you can no longer be in contact with people?
It's very strange dealing with Chinese people, not just those in China, but even those in Australia and even some of my relatives, because I don't want to endanger them or make them scared or harm their business prospects, careers in China. So I go on a strictly, I take cues from them. And if people seem okay with being in contact, I'm all open, but I don't want want them to somehow feel that I'm, associating with me will lead to the MSS putting them on their radar, or I don't know how creative their paranoias are. So it's hard to make friends or keep up, rediscover friendships when you have this unspoken fear. When I when I was arrested, my old colleagues at CGTN used a code name Elephant, because all of a sudden, any interviews that I was in was erased from the archives or from the website, and nobody could talk about me. So I was the elephant in the room.
Julian.
Hi, Lei. Julian Haddon here. And I've got to disclose, we know each other. We used to work together. I worked for CGTN through AP when there were big events on, like APEC, G20, those kind of things. I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing, speaking out so much, inspiring. I followed your case when you were detained. Obviously very upsetting. How hard it must be for you and your kids. Thank you so much for what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you for all of you for having followed my case.
I should say that Julian is more responsible than anybody for the programme tonight, so we owe him a debt. Just looking on a more positive note, where are you going now? What's in your life?
I'm actually working on media initiatives that would help, I guess, bridge this asymmetry, or let's say inform the public more about China, and hopefully encouraging more overseas Chinese to become engaged in civil society, because I feel that when Chinese people go overseas, they can sometimes remain in their bubble. Chinese social media apps, China holidays, Chinese friends, and not really understand or value or use the freedom that they now have. The freedom to speak up, the freedom to know the truth, the freedom to help somebody. And also, they sometimes feel neglected or demonized by, let's say, Australian society. And like I said, the Chinese people and China and the regime are different things. And to that end, I want the non-Chinese speaking part of the society to have more informed opinions about China and not be stuck in their various polarized China hugger or China basher echo chambers.
Right, we'll take one very last question because you got lost.
Hello, Paul Williams. You've had a very, very hard time, and that's very much appreciated. But my question is, you're sort of speaking as a foreign journalist because you're speaking English. To what extent do you think the problems you had were due to the fact that you are, originally Chinese, racially Chinese? Do you think that was a big contributing factor to the way you were treated?
I think the state security ministry or the whole state machine has a special hatred of those who used to be part of them. For example, I know, people who used to work in the foreign ministry or the state security ministry are sentenced more harshly and treated more harshly. And then you have people like me, born in China, but then became foreign citizens. And we're seen as, in some way, as traitors as well. And the actual foreigners, and especially Caucasians, are seen as perhaps less evil, or not evil, but they're treated with less of that special hatred. And the disinformation and the vitriol against me on the Chinese internet speak to that. Because China's traitor, that special Chinese word hanjian, is about the worst name you could call somebody. And I get called that and worse names by these state-paid bots and trolls. It's almost like making an example or a jealousy. That's about as far as I can understand anyway.
Well, Lei, I'd like to thank you for taking all this time and being so intimate with us, actually. It's as if you're in the room.
Thank you.
We hope very much that you will come up here and visit us comfortably in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks for having me. And for the thoughtful questions.